Hello and welcome. My name is Marvin and I lead a team of professional cycling coaches called Alpine Cols. Our specialty is coaching amateurs for Grand Fondos and especially challenging events like the Etape du Tour. We're just back from a coaching camp down in Nice, where we spent 5 days coaching a group of 12 cyclists on the actual route of this year's Etape and working on their climbing and descending skills to make sure they can all achieve their objectives. The purpose of this presentation is to give you some insights into what it takes to do well and help you plan to achieve your best performance on July the 6th. Let's take a quick look at the course. Just in case you need reminding, the Etape du Tour is a major physical and mental challenge, including 4 big climbs which add up in total to over 72 kilometers of climbing, as well as 44 kilometers of descending. Even for the Tour de France, it's a big day in the mountains. Most people will take between 7 and 10 hours to finish, and there's always a big percentage who abandon and don't make it to the finish. There are 2 essential things you need to get right for a successful ride. Firstly, pacing, especially on the climbs, of course, and secondly, fueling. Both of these require a proper race plan and then the ability to stick to it. You've probably heard this quote from Benjamin Franklin before. He wasn't a cyclist, obviously, but his quote is still highly relevant for us. Those who fail to plan to fail. So what should be in your plan? You need a plan first for how you're going to taper so that you arrive in the best possible condition for the event, for your travel and final preparations so that all goes smoothly without stress, and then of course for the race itself, broken down into sections. And finally, for how you're going to remember all of that on the day. As I speak, there are only 12 days left before the Etape. Some people could do their last long, hard rides this coming weekend. Others would be better beginning their taper in the next couple of days. Tapering is highly individual, and what works for one person may not work for another. Your taper should be longer if you're older, less fit, less strong, or recover slowly, and shorter if you're younger, very fit, very strong, and recover quickly. If in doubt, back off sooner. Remember, the goal of the taper is to eliminate fatigue without losing fitness. Training hard right up to the event is very risky for little payoff, so if in doubt, back off. My general suggestion is to reduce training volume by at least 50% in the final few days and to limit the intensity. But again, this is highly individual, and particularly for very strong riders, an aggressive taper can be beneficial. I've personally learned that it doesn't work for me, and I'm better off being fully rested, but that I'm older than most of you. The next part of your planning concerns your travel and final preparations for leading up to the start. This is mostly common sense, but it's much better to think it through and plan it out in advance so you don't get caught in a last-minute panic. So first of all, plan your travel carefully, including all details. Confirm your accommodation, obviously. Book your evening meal the night before the Etape. That's the last time when you want to be running around looking for a restaurant. When you're ready to start packing, it's a good idea to use a checklist for your kit to make sure you don't forget anything. And finally, pack your bike at least 1 day in advance to avoid last-minute problems. If you'd like a copy of our checklist for sportives, these type of events, send me an email at info@alpinecols.com and I'll be happy to send you a copy. So now let's look at your event plan. Your pacing strategy depends on your objective, which could be to win, to achieve your best possible result, to finish both before the cutoff. This last one is already a serious challenge, and every year large numbers of people are unable to finish. So each of these objectives requires a different pacing strategy. We'll look very briefly at each of them in turn. If you want to win, you have no choice. You must ride with the lead group and bide your time to attack, most probably on the final climb. If your goal is to get the best possible result for your current level, then you must ride as close as possible to your limits. In other words, climb at the highest pace you can sustain for 72 kilometers of climbing. Gaining 2 or 3 minutes by riding hard on the Col de Brosse, the first big climb, for example, can easily cost you 10 minutes or more on the later climbs. And finally, if your goal is to be an official finisher, then you should work backwards from the cutoff times and make sure you get through them in time. The official time limits are 2:30 at La Bollène-Vésubie, which is after the descent from the Col de Chirini, and then at 4:30 on the Col de la Colmiane, which is the third climb. To make sure you get there in time, I suggest you give yourself a time objective to be over the Col de Brosse and another to be over the Col de Chirini. Now, however strong you are and whatever your objective, it remains critical to get your pacing right. Here's a quote from Matt Fitzgerald, who's one of the world's foremost experts on pacing. Pacing is the art of finding your limit. So getting your pacing right means constantly asking yourself, given the distance remaining, am I going a little too fast, about right, or a little too slow? The answer is probably going to vary depending on where you are on the course. Let's take a look at 4 different points where your pacing decisions might change. These are at the start, on the climbs, on the descents, and on the final climb. So we'll look at each of those in turn. First, at the start, the Etape always starts very fast. There are 14 kilometers to ride through and out of Nice to the first climb, mostly on the flat or a gentle rise. It makes sense, therefore, to try to stay with a group that is slightly stronger than you, but not to overdo it and go too deep. The best advice is to choose a wheel to follow and try to ride as fast as possible for the least effort. It means staying very close behind the rider in front of you. If you lose that wheel or the rider turns out to be too slow, then jump across to another. Remember, there's a very long way to go. Don't get carried away by the excitement and adrenaline and think that by some miracle overnight you've become a super strong rider. It isn't going to happen. Now, on the climbs. The best way to see the climbs is as a series of individual time trials. Ignore everybody else and ride at your own pace, which should be the highest pace which you feel you can sustain to the end, not just of this climb, but of all of them together. Be particularly conservative on the Col de Nice, Col de Brosse, the first little one and the first big one, because you'll be feeling fresh and strong, so you'll be tempted to overdo it. Remember, it's usually more effective to start slow and finish fast than the opposite. Now on the descents. There are 3 major descents, the Col de Brosse, the Col de Chirini, and the Col de la Colmiane. The first one is quite long at 11 kilometers. The road's in perfect condition and has good visibility, but there are a lot of tight 180-degree hairpins. If you're not a strong descender, be careful and beware of the other riders. The descent from the Col de Chirini is longer still at 15 kilometers. It's steep, narrow, twisty, and many of the corners are unpredictable. You can't see the end of them, and some of them tighten unexpectedly. I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but I fear there will be accidents here. So be cautious. The best you can hope to gain by descending fast is a couple of minutes, and you could very well lose everything. If you want to see what I mean, check out our video on YouTube. It's called Etape du Tour 2024 First Ride, and I filmed a good part of the descent of the Chirini. Finally, the descent from the Colmiane is quite long, but relatively straightforward on a good wide road with only a few tight corners. So not too bad. Finally, on the last climb to the Col de la Quillon, this is where you will find out if your pacing strategy has been good or not. First, stop at the feed station at Saint-Sauveur at the bottom and make sure you have enough water and food for the last 16 kilometers. You'll need 2 full bottles of water and several energy bars or the equivalent. If you misjudge your pace on the earlier climbs, this climb could easily take you 2 or 3 hours. Many people find the final climb at the Etape to be supremely challenging and are forced to walk a good part of it, or indeed just to give up. But if you got your pace right, the energy you saved at the cost of a couple of minutes on each of the earlier climbs should really start to pay back. In the best case, you'll be able to accelerate progressively to finish at the highest intensity of the day, overtaking dozens of other riders in the last few kilometers. Now, none of what I've said so far tells you exactly how hard to ride in terms of an actual number. I've talked about judging your pace to be as close as possible to your limit, but this isn't easy to do. Importantly, it's subject to error based on the excitement and the adrenaline and other riders overtaking you. So again, miracles don't happen very often, and it's unlikely you'll be much stronger at the Etape than you were in training or at other events. So let's look at how you can use the evidence from your previous events or your training rides to create a pacing plan for yourself. The best evidence comes from your power meter, if you've got one. Assuming it's always calibrated and the data is accurate, it tells you all you need to know. But what if you don't have a power meter? Well, if you don't have a power meter, you can use VAM, your vertical speed in elevation meters per hour, which in the absence of wind and at speeds below about 15 kilometers per hour is very closely related to power. You can find this data on Strava after your ride, or you can see it in real time if you add VAM, and especially lap VAM, to your bike computer. In that case, trip the lap, of course, at the beginning of the climb. You want to look for the longest possible climbs and see what you did in your historical data. In the example here, I did a 54-minute climb at 229 watts and a VAM of 891 meters per hour. These precise numbers aren't important, of course, you need to find your own, just to show you where to find them. You can, of course, always also use heart rate as an indicator. Heart rate measures your internal load, but it's less reliable than power or VAM, which measure your external load, because heart rate is influenced by many other factors such as stress, temperature, caffeine you may have drunk or taken, dehydration, and so on and so forth. Finally, but it's useful. So I'm not saying don't use heart rate, but you need to interpret it with care. Finally, some people are sufficiently in tune with their feelings to get a good result just by feeling the effort. But to get this right takes a lot of experience. Let's come back to power and see how you can use evidence of your past performance to plan your pacing at the Etape. I'm going to use the 2018 Etape as an example, because it's the last one I personally rode in. Here's what it looked like. There were 4 big climbs and a couple of smaller ones. The main difference from this year's Etape was the 45-kilometer mostly flat to ride before the first climb, and then the 18 kilometers of flat before the third and fourth climbs. This meant that the ability to ride fast in a group was very important. But as usual at the Etape, the main gains were to be had on the climbs. So riding in a group's not a big deal this year, but it was in 2018. So here were my pacing goals: to ride in a group and draft for the flat parts while minimizing hard efforts to stay in the group. Then do all the climbs at my highest sustainable pace, and finally give it everything on the final climb. So let's see how I determine my highest sustainable pace. I started by listing the events I'd already ridden that year, which were the Carima, Liège-Bastogne-Liège, the Trois Cols, the Time Megève, and the Grand Beau. So these gave me real-life data for the average power I sustained on the climbs during these events. My power was lower on Liège-Bastogne-Liège than on the others because it was twice as long, quite simply. The Time Megève and the Grand Beau, on the other hand, were sub-maximal efforts because I was accompanying and coaching clients at those 2 events. I know I had about 20 watts in hand, so those 210 and 220 watts can be increased. I estimated that the Etape would take me about 7 hours and be harder than all except Liège-Bastogne-Liège. So I finally settled on a target power of 235 watts, which was 85% of my FTP at the time. When you do this for yourself, if you haven't ridden any suitable recent competitive events, just use your hard training rides instead, and maybe adjust it if you know you weren't going at race pace. So let's see what happened. A great feature of the Etape du Tour for cycling coaches like me is to give you your individual ranking on each of the big climbs. So here are my results on the first big climb, the Col de la Coifferie. The yellow recording, by the way, is my power meter. So I've done this climb, the Coifferie, dozens of times at a higher power, so I had to force myself to keep the pace down and let other riders overtake me. Believe me, I was overtaken by hundreds of riders. My final numbers were slightly above the target at 238 watts, and my rank was 2,576 on that climb. The next climb was the Glières, to the Col de Glières. This is quite short, but extremely steep, so it's almost inevitable that the power will be higher. I rode it at 91% and was the 1,728th rider on this climb, so you can already see the number of people who rode too hard on the first climb. The third big climb was the Col de Rome, which again is a steep, challenging climb. I rode this at 86%, so again, very slightly above my plan. But by now, my prudence on the earlier climbs was really paying off, as all those who'd climbed them too fast were now struggling. I was 673rd on this climb, so huge increase since the first 2. And finally, the Col de la Colombière to finish. I could no longer manage my target of 85%, but once again, I improved my position. overtaking many other riders as the 467th fastest on this climb. So the main lesson to take away from this is that it really pays to go easy on the early climbs so that you can maintain the same pace on the later ones. Overall, aiming for a negative split, which I didn't quite achieve here, will give you much better results than going out from the start with all guns blazing. The second lesson is that your race pace must be based on evidence and not hope. So do the analysis for yourself and settle on a number that will work for you. Okay, that's it for pacing. Let's look now at fueling. Whether you get this right or wrong can have as big an impact on your performance as pacing. The first point is that you need to start with a full tank of glycogen in your muscles. You do this by carb loading, but there's no need to be obsessive or see this as complicated. All you need to do is eat an extra serving of carbs per meal on the Wednesday and Thursday before the Etape, and then eat normally on Friday. Remember to compensate for the extra calories by eating less fat on these 2 days, so cut down on things like butter, oil, cheese, fatty meats, and so on and so forth. And if you're eating a lot of pasta, go easy on the olive oil and parmesan. Now, when you come to the event itself, be aware you're likely to consume somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 calories of energy, or likely to burn it, during the Etape, as well as the 2,000 or so keeping you alive during the day. 5,000 calories is the equivalent of 30 or 40 energy bars. So current recommendations are that from the start, you should aim at consuming at least 60 grams of carbs per hour, which is equivalent to 240 calories, and as much as 90 or even 100, 360 to 400 calories, if you're riding very hard. A bottle of energy drink or a food item like a banana, a gel, or whatever, typically contains about 30 grams of carbs. So this means you need to consume 2 to 4 typical items of food or energy drink per hour. The actual amount you can consume depends on what you're used to doing in training. It's not easy to digest and make use of 400 calories per hour while you're riding hard. So if you haven't practiced it, don't attempt it at the event. You won't manage it, I can guarantee. But you should see 60 grams or 240 calories or roughly 2 items per hour as the minimum. Here are a few tips for fueling at the Etape. Firstly, carry as much as possible with you for 2 reasons. 1, you know what you've got and you won't be surprised by something that doesn't agree with you. And 2, you save an awful lot of time by only needing to pick up water. If you've got to queue also for food, you're going to waste a lot of time unnecessarily. Second point, test everything in advance because you never know what's going to work with your stomach when you're riding hard. Third, avoid bars which are dry and crumbly because it will stick in your throat and maybe even go down the wrong way, and that's a real problem. Fourth, pre-open the wrappers to make it easy to access. And finally, eat little and often, every 15 minutes rather than once per hour. Now we can pull all of this together in a race plan. I'm going to show you an example plan for an experienced male rider wearing 71 kilograms with a current FTP of 240 watts and a total target ride time of a bit less than 7.5 hours. This is only an example, so don't copy it for yourself, but think it through carefully and adapt it to your own level and experience. The first section is the start, which is the 14 kilometers from the start line itself to the beginning of the Col de Nice. This will take most riders about 30 minutes. A good tactic here is to pick a good wheel to follow and make sure the pace is sustainable for you without making too many hard efforts to stay with that rider. In terms of nutrition, you might take a 30-gram gel, perhaps just a couple of minutes before the start, and then drink a third of a bottle of energy mix during the 30 minutes. Next is the short climb to the Col de Nice. As we saw earlier, it's really important to climb at your own pace, and you must get your nutrition and hydration right so that you don't fall behind. So keep going on the nutrition and hydration. Then there's a very short descent through the village and across the bridge before you come to the start of the Col de Brosse. So here is the first big climb. In our example plan, the climb will take about 50 minutes. If your goal is only to finish, you can afford to take longer, but you should be over by 10:30 at the latest, I reckon. The climb is quite irregular, so make sure you keep a steady pace at a constant effort changing gear as necessary to maintain a comfortable cadence. Make sure you eat and drink at least every 15 minutes during the climb. The descent from the Col de Brosse is quite long and has multiple tight hairpins, so if you're not an experienced descender, be very careful. Again, don't forget to eat and drink. The descents are a good time to eat something more solid, like dried fruit or maybe an energy bar, but be very careful and don't do this at high speed. Okay, here's the rest of the plan, which I won't comment in detail. You can pause the video here if you want to read it, but again, by all means, use it as inspiration, but make sure you adapt it to your own needs. Remember that failing to plan is planning to fail. Planning's not enough. You also need to stick to the plan. So how do you remember it? Well, here we can learn from the pros. This is Mathieu van der Poel's nutrition sticker from the Tour of Flanders. The plan for him was to consume upwards of 100 grams of carbs per hour. On that sticker, you can see every 20 kilometers, there are some signs. The circles are rice cakes. The rectangles are energy bars. The gel icons are gels, of course, and the bottles are bottles of energy drink. So you can copy this idea, do something similar, and then stick it onto your own stem or handlebars for yourself. It's a really good way to remember what you plan to do. So let's recap. There are two essential things to get right, which are pacing and fueling. Both of these require careful planning and then sticking to the plan. If you follow the recommendations I've just explained, you should be pretty close to your best possible result on the day. That's it for this presentation. If you'd like more, check out the Alpine Cols channel on YouTube, where you'll find 4 more videos on the 2024 Etape. The first 2 were really about how to train, so a bit late now, but the first ride video is the most useful one to watch or re-watch before the event, because there's plenty of video of the actual route itself, including the descents. So for now on, this is Marvin saying thanks for listening, stay safe, and good luck. Finally, if you found this video helpful, please do go back and give it a like and maybe add a comment. It really helps. Thanks very much.